Hi, everybody. My name is Sveta. I'm one of the librarians at DePaul University. I've also got my colleague Holly Cerny, who is co-moderating the session with me and will be helping answer your questions and troubleshoot technical issues in the chat. So feel free to reach out if that comes up. I'm really excited to, this is our first breakout session of the summit, and we are excited to have Jaclyn Spraetz and Nate Floyd from Miami University Libraries at Miami of Ohio here to present I'm Sensing Some Hostility, Teaching Students to Overcome Personal Biases When Evaluating Sources. So kind of thinking through how our own personal biases can make evaluating sources more difficult and how we can incorporate the hostile media effect into our information literacy instruction. Once again, our hashtag for the summit, if you'd like to tweet about the presentation, is IL Summit 22. I'll put that in the chat. If you have questions, we'll have some time at the end for questions, as well as, I just wanted to let you know that if you need a live transcript of the presentation, it should be turned on. There's a live transcript button in the bottom corner, so you can toggle those closed captions on and off as needed. All right, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Jaclyn and Nate. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Sveta. So I'm Jaclyn Spraetz, and I'm joined by my colleague Nate Floyd to introduce the hostile media effect in information literacy instruction. So looking at our presentation outline there on the next slide, we're first going to discuss the hostile media effect more in depth and talk about examples of the hostile media effect, the definition for it, and also its original study and more current studies. Second, we are going to share information literacy classroom activities and how they can incorporate the hostile media effect. And then lastly, we will share student learning outcomes and why we think teaching media effects is beneficial for students. So before we dive into the hostile media effect, I wanted to first give you context for our broader project and why we see a place for media effects in information literacy. Our research looks at how using media effects in the classroom can help students have a deeper engagement with the information ecosystem. The ACRL framework for information literacy argues that meta-literacy demands behavioral, affective, cognitive, and metacognitive engagement with the information ecosystem. We believe media effects can help us reach meta-literacy because media effects, which are generally defined as the social or psychological responses occurring in individuals as a result of exposure to media messages, can help students generate transformative new perspectives on information production. And it also guides students to critically reflect on the ways media can influence them. There are 3 types of media effects, which include behavioral, affective, and cognitive effects. And we were surprised at the similarity in the language used here to describe both media effects and meta-literacy. We have discussed media effects at other conferences, including discussing agenda setting at LOEX and framing at the National Association for Media Literacy Education annual conference. And we are excited to dig into how the hostile media effect can be used in information literacy instruction. Nate will now talk more about the hostile media effect using sports as a depoliticized example of how feelings of partisanship can influence our perceptions of bias in the news.
So this is Joe Buck. Joe Buck is an American sportscaster. In 2022, he signed with ESPN, and before that, he worked for Fox Sports. And Joe is a national broadcaster. Here we have him in the broadcast booth at the Super Bowl, and here we have him in the broadcast booth at the World Series. On the level of broadcasting and having an audience, you might think of Joe Buck as the New York Times or the Washington Post, right? A major brand that has national and even international reach. The thing about Joe Buck, though, not everyone likes Joe Buck. Here is an image from the 2014 World Series. And on the left-hand side, we have a San Francisco Giant fan. And on the right side, we have a Kansas City Royals fan. And both members from both fan communities are annoyed with Joe Buck. On the left, we have somebody saying, I'm here, so I don't have to listen to Joe Buck. And on the right, we have a Kansas City Royal fan enumerating all the costs that that he incurred to go to the World Series. Nevertheless, still better than listening to Joe Buck, right? Here's another fan. They bought tickets and drove 8 hours to avoid listening to Joe Buck, right? In the bottom right-hand corner, we have a rather dark meme. It could always be worse. Joe Buck could be giving us virus updates. Heaven help us if that were true. At least one Chicago Cubs fan suggested that Joe Buck was in fact the Zodiac killer, right? Now, we say all this, right, to set up talking about Joe Buck and how fans from both sides of, of a particular game have an issue with the way he calls and does his announcing. So here's Joe Buck on the Conan O'Brien show.
There are nights where I think I have a tough game.
And Joe is going to talk a little bit about why it sucks to be Joe Buck. And he's going to talk about this dynamic between fans and his own career, right? Now, as you're listening to this and as we work through some of these examples, we're using sports fandom as a proxy for political partisanship. So when you're thinking about Joe Buck, think about Joe Buck as a sort of national news service, right? He's a broadcaster. He is impartial. He's neutral. Nevertheless, his neutral approach still incites these very sort of strong reactions from fans, right? And again, we're thinking of fans as highly partisan individuals, right? So here's Joe Buck on the Conan O'Brien show talking about his relationship with the fan community.
Gig. Mostly, I think this is a really sweet gig, but comedy can be tough. I think you have a very difficult job because you are dealing with sports fans. And as you know, they are insane and they're constantly on the lookout for someone like you, play-by-play.
Right.
To say
they
anything.
See me coming.
They see you coming and they're waiting and they can dissect anything you say and they can take exception to it. And people get really mad at you.
No, they do. And I get it because when the games count the most, I show up. But all year long, especially in baseball, Cub fans are listening to the Cub announcers, Indian fans are listening to the Indians announcers, and the Giants and the Dodgers, and they want to hear their guys. And then I show up, and I'm not rooting for either side.
Right,
Therefore,
you are the national announcer.
Each side thinks I'm somehow rooting against their team.
Yes.
So it sucks.
Yes, it sucks.
So Joe Buck said lots of interesting things there. What he really did, though, was set us up to talk about the hostile media effect. And so what Joe said there was they want to hear their guys, and then I show up and I'm not rooting for either side, and each side thinks I'm somehow rooting against their team. And so this is a very similar, a good way to sort of preview this definition for the hostile media effect, right? We're finally getting to the hostile media effect. And that is defined as the tendency for individuals with a strong pre-existing attitude on an issue, say, for instance, a Cubs fan, to perceive that ostensibly neutral, even-handed media coverage of a topic, say Joe Buck, is biased against their side and in favor of their antagonist point of view. So here we have a model of the hostile media effect. And before I lose you, before your eyes glaze over looking at this model and these figures, if you're like me, I sometimes have a hard time interpreting these figures and models. So we're going to dive into this a little bit. And this is also going to inform our classroom activity and the worksheet that Jaclyn is going to show you a little bit later in this presentation. So before we dive in, let's sort of get our bearings with this chart. We're going to first walk through each of these 4 different categories: exposure to media, moderators, mediators, and the hostile media effect. The first thing we want to do is I've cut out the center part there because we want to focus first on how this chart, this figure is showing us a causal relationship beginning with exposure to media and ending with the hostile media effect. So on the left-hand side here, exposure to media coverage of an issue by individuals with a strong attitude on the topic. That's how this begins. And this ends with, depending on certain demographic factors, it ends with the hostile media effect taking place, where I'm somebody who's highly partisan. I can read ostensibly neutral and even-handed coverage of a topic related to something that I'm concerned about, and I will think that they're hostile and biased against me, right? So when we're looking at this chart, the endpoints here are the main focus: the exposure to media to begin and the hostile media effect to end, right? And going along with our example here, we're thinking about Joe Buck as the media. He's sort of the proxy for national media. And then these highly involved fans are proxies for highly partisan individuals in society or in your classroom. That's the idea here, right? Now, in between this causal relationship, we have moderating and mediating variables that predict whether and how the hostile media effect might materialize, right? So moderators, you can think of a moderator as asking this question: under what conditions and for whom will this relationship materialize, right? Because just because I'm a highly partisan person, when I encounter neutral reporting on an issue that I care about, I'm not always going to have that hostile media effect. It kind of depends. There need to be certain conditions met before that hostile media effect will actually take place. And that's what these moderators are doing here for this causal relationship. Moderators are asking whether something will actually happen. Mediators, though, are answering the question of how will it actually happen, right? Mediators are asking this question: how will this causal relationship materialize and through what mechanism, right? To try to maybe give a sort of another example is, if you are sitting in a dark room, you can't see anything. The light switch, the light in the room, is moderating your ability to see. Your eye and your brain and your ocular nerves and those systems will mediate your sight, but whether the light is on or off will determine whether you can see or not. And so in this relationship between the hostile media, between exposure to media and the hostile media effect, there are these these variables, these third variables in the middle that are going to help us understand whether and how this effect will take place. So let's dive in first, this exposure to media. So here we're just talking about highly engaged fans, people with a strong attitude, being exposed to Joe Buck. That's the first step in this process. The second step is, let's try to figure out whether or not we're actually going to get a hostile media effect. And we have to sort of work through these particular questions, right? So remember that the moderator is modifying this relationship, and it's answering the question: under what conditions will this effect materialize? So in the question of Joe Buck, let's think about media reach. If I'm a fan of the Chicago Cubs and there's a sports journalist talking about the Chicago Cubs, if this is a journalist that's just like on Twitter and doesn't have a lot of followers, I'm probably not going to get that upset about it. But if it's Joe Buck, who has this huge audience, this huge media reach, I'm more likely, right, to have a hostile media effect. I'm more likely to get upset about it, right? So media reach is one of the moderators. Involvement is another moderator. So involvement on the as far as the fans go, right? How involved am I as a fan? Do I buy the jerseys? Do I go to the games? Do I post on message boards, right? How attached am I to this issue? That's a second moderator, right? So media reach, how big is the audience? How many people are likely to see this Joe Buck talking about my favorite team? And then how involved am I? Are they my favorite team? Do I feel like a part of that community? And that's what the third and the fourth thing listed here, degree of in-group identification and out-group membership of the source, is getting at that social identity. I feel like I'm a part of the Cubs rooting fan community. Joe Buck certainly is not. So my radar is going to be up. My antennas are up. He's got huge media reach. I'm very involved with my favorite sports team, and I have a strong degree of in-group identification with my fan community, and Joe Buck is not part of that fan community. When we think then about mediators, so in this relationship, we're likely to see a hostile media effect. Joe Buck has huge media reach. I'm a very involved fan, and I feel a part of that sports fan community for my favorite team. So the question now is, how will this media effect actually materialize, right? Well, one thing fans will do is they will selectively categorize the information that Joe Buck gives them, right? So when Joe Buck says something that is unfair or maybe is even fair, they'll categorize it as unfair, right? There'll be this selective thing happening. They'll apply different standards, right, to the things that Joe Buck says. When Joe Buck says something that they agree with, they'll think, yep, that's right. Joe Buck knows what he's talking about. When Joe Buck says something that they perceive as hostile or that they don't quite agree with, they'll believe Joe Buck is out to ruin their team, right? And then the final sort of mediator here is, what are your prior beliefs about media bias? If you are already somebody who believes that media are heavily biased, then that's going to be the avenue to get you to this hostile media effect, where I end and I believe that the media are biased against my side and in favor of antagonists. Now, you may ask yourself, why do we care about the hostile media effect? And the reason we care is that when people exhibit these hostile media effects, they can become indignant about, I mean, let's run through some of the things listed under these mediators, and you think to yourself, if this sounds like any of the highly partisan people you know in your life, are they indignant about the political process? Do they desire to correct perceived wrongs? Do they feel a sense of reduced political efficacy? And do they have a mistrust of media and mistrust of democracy, right? And when people feel that way, they're likely to take action, right? They may withdraw socially. They may sort of develop this defiance of government, and there may be some enhanced political participation, but it's probably not going to be the type of political participation that we would like to see, right? Now, this study, of course, this theory really started in the 1950s. There were two college professors who watched this college football game between Dartmouth and Princeton. It was a very violent game. And they showed footage of this game to different fan groups. They showed Dartmouth students film of the game, and they showed Princeton students film of the game. And of course, both fan groups had wildly divergent views of what actually happened on the field. And I just thought this was a sort of a good quote to show from the study, where they say, in brief, the data here indicate that there is no such thing as a game existing out there in its own right, which people merely observe. The game exists for a person and is experienced by him only insofar as certain happenings have significance in terms of his purpose. Now, that sounds a lot like that attachment and that involvement moderator that we were talking about earlier, right? And then out of all the occurrences going on in the environment, the person selects those that have some significance for him from his own egocentric position in the total matrix, right? So in this original study from the 50s, we're finding what are these mechanisms for why do sports fans see different things on the field. And again, keeping in mind that we're just using fanship as a proxy for political participation or political partisanship, right? That was one study done in the 50s. The second major study that really looked at hostile media effect and brought it into the world of media and news communication was the study done in the 80s, where they showed pro-Arab and pro-Israeli individuals newscasts covering the Arab-Israeli conflict from 1982 in Israel. And of course, partisans on both sides felt that the media was biased against their side. In a more recent study, this is from 2018, researchers looked at different social media accounts and in fact built an experiment based on the hostile media effect. And what they did was they showed different partisans a news story shared by a Republican and one shared by a Democrat. The news story is exactly the same. It's identical, right? But people perceived when a story was shared by the Democratic person, And if I was a Republican, I would think the story is news biased. If I was a Democrat and the story was shared by a Republican, I'm so focused on the source that I cannot actually engage with the news, right? And that's the idea behind this hostile media effect. Is it's trying to say, why are we having strong reactions to the media? And so Jaclyn is going to talk a little bit about how we have taken this idea and this model and turned it into a classroom activity and try to engage students in this topic.
All right, so as far as classroom activities that incorporate the hostile media effect in our information literacy instruction, we find that activities that have both a reflection component and time to, practice in the classroom is really important to have both of those things when we're teaching students about the hostile media effect as well as other media effects. So this is an activity that we thought could be a good introduction to the hostile media effect, where we first asked students to define bias and to also think of something they read recently that they felt was biased. And so this gives them room to share their understanding of it. But what I have noticed, when I work with students is that students, especially younger students, have kind of a rigid definition of bias and often see it mostly from the source or from the author who is writing that article that they are biased. And so we want to have these follow-up questions with students to have them think about, their own perceptions of bias. So when they were thinking about something recently they read that they felt was biased, were they particularly close to that topic? Did they feel that it went against their beliefs or their perceptions about that topic? So next, we have ideas for a main classroom activity borrowing Perloff's model of the hostile media effect, which Nate has just shared with you. So we really want to focus on those moderators and how they may cause us to have a hostile media effect. So we're focusing on media reach, involvement, degree of in-group identification, and out-group membership of source. So looking on the next slide, this is the 4 steps to our classroom activity. So we want students to first think of an issue that is very important to them and something that they feel comfortable sharing with others in the class. So that's very key to this as well. And second, we want students to also find an issue that is not important to them. And so once they have figured out a very important issue to them, one not important to them, we want them to look up each issue on Google News and find at least one article for each of those issues, and then use this worksheet to help them kind of work through how they would rate each article's overall bias against them. So we, want to leave their choice of issues completely open to them. Especially here, student choice is very important because we want them to make those connections that they're practicing in the class outside of the class, when they leave our classroom. So some on the left-hand side, we pulled from the Pew Research Center top issues for voters, but we also, can see it being as serious or not serious as students would want to make it. So students can also choose, a particular celebrity or movie or television show that is very important to them. And also, thinking about, well, there's something that they're reading a lot about, but it's not important to them. And they could use that as an example as well. So looking at the worksheet, we'll just go kind of through it step by step. So the first thing is looking at media reach. And we don't care if students have that exact terminology. We really want them to just pick up the ideas behind that terminology. So it's really important that we ask, clarifying questions on the worksheet, like looking at media reach. Is the article very popular? Is it reaching a large audience? Are there a lot of people who may read this article and rate whether they think that it has a small reach or a large reach? And then next, looking at their involvement. So, how important is this issue to them? Is it something they have read a lot about, have watched a lot? And how much do they know about it? So then the next one is in-group identification. So do they have a sense of belonging with this issue? Do they feel a sense of community with this issue? You know, I have favorite television shows that I feel a sense of community with other people who like that show. So how much do they feel that they have this identification with this group? And then also looking at the source and whether they are a valid representation of what they are talking about. So do students see that the people talking about this source are a part of that community, or are they not a part of that community? And so this all kind of culminates to students' thoughts of whether this article is very biased against their issue or not. So we want them to rate that, and then also explain their thoughts about this issue, and kind of explain maybe their thoughts looking at, you know, their work on the worksheet overall. And so we want students to do this twice with the worksheet for both of their issues. And then once they have done that, then we want to give them some time to debrief and, you know, think about how all of this correlates over the, you know, entirety of the worksheet. So does the amount of importance that they feel that this issue is to them affect how biased they feel that that article is? Is the fact that the author who's writing it not a part of that community a big deal for them? So if we look at the next slide, you know, this is the reason why we want them to share something that they feel comfortable talking about in class, because they're going to debrief with a peer, just to be able to get kind of their thoughts out. And kind of look and compare, you know, are their ratings of bias among the two articles they read the same, or are they different? And like I said, what are the correlations here? So, you know, did their level of involvement and sense of belonging with the issue associate them to have a more negative look and see if there's more bias in that article? And we also want students to kind of think about, you know, are there any other factors that played into their perception of bias or objectivity in the articles they read? This could give us a chance for us to clarify, you know, anything that they have questions about, and talk more about whether or not the hostile media effect came into play when they were looking at their articles. So then, so we also, you know, have taught media effects with students and see that reflection is just a very important piece to this, because it really solidifies how students think about it in the classroom to how they may be able to apply it when they're looking and encountering news just in their daily lives. So we want students to again, define what the hostile media effect is, and also think about, you know, now that they know what this is, you know, where have they seen this happen? Have they experienced it? We want to know from students, do they think that it is important to know about the hostile media effect? And can it, or how might it change how they interact with news and other information sources in the future? And so on the next slide here, so the last 3 activities that I shared with you are ones we think that could work really well for a one-shot session. But if you have more time and would like to spend, you know, more of that time on the hostile media effect, here are some other activities we thought could be really helpful for students. So the first one is thinking about, you know, after maybe we do that one-shot session, have students keep a journal and keep track of when they have strong reactions to media content that is either shared with them or that they encounter on their own, but also keeping track of when they see others reacting strongly to media content, and be thinking about if the hostile media effect is playing a part in these reactions. And we want students to kind of think about, you know, if you see someone who's mistrusting a particular source, you know, or calling something fake news that isn't fake news, is the hostile media effect playing a part in that? And can they kind of pull some of the things that they looked at on that worksheet when they go about, you know, encountering information in the future? So this was a really a cool assignment that Nate and I found as we have been kind of thinking about how to incorporate hostile media effect in in our teaching. And so this is an assignment from Mike Wagner, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He teaches a mass communication class there where they have a unit on media effects. And this assignment asks students to create a meme based on one of the media effects. And so these memes on this slide are representing the hostile media effect. And so we thought that this would be a really interesting assignment that gets students to kind of show their knowledge and also create something. And I will just quickly share our student learning outcomes. So we want students to reflect on how media influences them in order to think critically and analytically about the consumption, production, and dissemination of information. We want students to implement strategies that can make them that can help them make sense of the mixed and at times chaotic information landscape of bad faith actors and political partisanship. And we want students to be able to practice strategies that they learn from the hostile media effect, as well as other media effects, and they can apply them from the classroom into their daily lives. And so that is our presentation on the hostile media effects, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for this presentation. That was really fascinating. So we've got a couple of questions already in the chat. I'm going to let Holly kind of read them out, but please keep putting your questions there. We've got about 15 minutes left in the session, so should be some time for a good conversation. All right.
Yeah, I think the first question we got was just if we could make this worksheet available, because there was a lot of positive feedback about it as well. So if you're willing to share, I think you have an audience.
Yes, we would be happy to do that. I'm happy to grab the link now, or if you suggest there's a better way to share that.
Sure, we could put the link up in the chat if that works for folks.
We could share it also with the recording in the kind of captioning of the recording, if that works as well.
We also have some questions about really liking the activity and what classes you were using the activity with, and then how much time the activity took in total, or maybe what sections of it took time.
So this particular activity is really informed by, we have tried to do hostile media effect in other classes. So there's a department here at Miami called Interactive Media Studies. They have a class for digital citizenship and information studies. And so that's been a venue where we've been invited to come in and do sort of one-off workshop type sessions. And that's really where we've done a lot of the media effects stuff. So we've done agenda setting and framing, and we have done hostile media effect, but we haven't done it exactly like this. And in fact, this model is really informed by our failure in a previous session where it just didn't work quite right. And so we came at it from a different perspective. So Jaclyn is actually teaching that digital citizenship class next fall. And I think, Jaclyn, you're planning to run this session then.
Yes, and so Nate ran that class this spring semester, and so we were able to practice a couple of other of the media effects during that class, but I'm planning on using the hostile media effect in that class. And I think that's another challenge, is thinking about how it might fit in other sessions that we do with students. I think that it could be a really great workshop as well. But I think that there's definitely a place for it. It's just kind of has to be a little more creative about where that might go.
Yeah, great. And then we have somebody asking how the students responded to the reflections.
So we haven't done this exact lesson with students yet, but we have done, similar lessons on other media effects with students. where we have had a reflection component at the end. And we usually, like, we've done this as an exit ticket that students submit as a Google form. And it's been really interesting to hear their responses. So we did one on agenda setting, and it was kind of getting students to kind of look at their news diets and where they might go for information, and how that can kind of sometimes they stick to kind of the same things that they've always gone to. So it was really interesting, and one of the reflections on that, to see that teaching that class with them, they were able to see, I might not be getting all the information that I need to get by just going to this news source. Maybe I need to like branch out. So I think that's probably the most interesting thing for me, is seeing kind of how they are going to use their knowledge of these media effects in their, when they encounter information on their own.
Great. And then we have asking, do you introduce students to the concept of hostile media effect prior to doing the activity with the 2 articles, or do you discuss it during or after the activity?
So one thing, I mean, I think this is an approach that we use in some of our other classes too, but whether we are the sort of instructor of record and like we have access to all of the email and the students and we know them, or we are sort of doing a guest lecture, what we normally do is we will find a sort of, a YouTube video that deconstructs whatever our media effect is in like 2 or 3 minutes, right? It's like oversimplified, but here's the basic idea. And then we'll normally find like a textbook and we'll only give students, 1 or 2 pages. We're not trying to overwhelm our undergrads. And so students are asked to watch a video and to read a sort of short selection on whatever media effect we are teaching. But then the key thing is that before they show up for class that day, they have to answer these questions that we've written in a Google form. So we know that students, number one, have done the reading and watched the video when they come to class. And then based on the quality of their responses, we can gauge what parts of this they're having trouble with. And then we also, in that Google form, make a space for students like, hey, what specific questions do you have about this particular issue? So we try to handle as much of that stuff before class starts. So we know going in, I know this student sitting over here has the perfect answer for this question. Is there a way I can get this student to tell this student what they know, right? And it's a way to get that dialogue going. So that's, I think, the thing for us when we do these media effects things, is that we try to give a long runway for the students, and we try to set up a system so we know that they have read, thought about this before they come to class, and we have a way to gauge whether they've understood it and what questions we can anticipate. But that's sort of our approach to doing that. Jaclyn, is that all of it? Did I miss anything?
No, that's a good response. And, I think like another thing that like we keep in mind too, is that this can get very complicated and there's a lot of information here. But I think really our main goal and our main takeaway for students is that they just have a new understanding of, how information is created and how it can influence them, how it influences us all. And I think that is the main takeaway we want them to get, is just to have a new perspective on that.
Great. And we have another question about whether the students ever become confused about whether they're learning to evaluate the bias of the sources or whether they are learning to evaluate their perception of bias. And do you find that some students have a hard time with the metacognition piece? And how do you address that in the session? That was a lot.
Well, certainly we don't get into meta literacy with the students. You know what I mean? Like we sort of like use the framework as like the skeleton, and then we build around that. And like, I mean, if you want to lose a group of students quickly, start talking to them about the framework, right? So we don't do that. We don't get into meta literacy or anything. We just sort of like show the lesson. And I don't know that students, I mean, again, if students are confused, we know what they're going to be confused about before they get to class so that we can address it right off the bat. And then we get other students to like help us explain, like, I know this student did the reading and really understood it. Let me see if this person can maybe help explain that. Did that answer the question? I feel like I missed the question. Jaclyn, what did I miss?
Well, I was also thinking that, like thinking about the classroom activities, we want to have room for, answering students' questions and getting clarification. So, part of that, when they're working through that worksheet, we want to walk around and help clarify any questions that they have. And also when when they're talking to a peer, we can walk around the room and overhear their conversations and, see how they're thinking about this. And then I also think, as part of the introductory activity, that's kind of a point. And I think that we need to keep kind of, reinforcing it, that we're not talking for this class session, we're not talking about the bias in an article, but we're talking about our own perceptions of bias. And I think that's an important thing to continue to clarify throughout the class.
Yeah, I think like, yeah, Jaclyn, that's a good point, is that so much of what we do in information literacy is we are teaching people to do things with information, right? There's the CRAP test, there's the SIFT method, there's lateral reading. There are all these things that we're going to do with media, but we feel there's not enough acknowledgement of like, well, the media is actually doing stuff to us too. And we have these cognitive processes that if I'm a hyper partisan person, the CRAP test doesn't help me, right? Because my own bias and partisanship, if I like that, it's like, if I knew that, I wouldn't be believing this to begin with, right? I'm super partisan. I need more than the CRAP test. I need to actually be reflective on my own sort of issue. And I think that we hope that when students hear politicians or highly partisan people talking about the lamestream media, we hope that that student may have that sort of brain event that says, well, maybe actually the media is like, nobody likes the guy that calls the balls and strikes, right? Nobody likes that person. And maybe this person is just highly partisan. And in fact, this is actually a fair assessment. That's, I think, another thing we want students to really take away.
You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry about that. I'm going to jump to a question that I feel is in the same world, which is asking, are you getting students to identify bias in a text or recognize their own biases?
It's definitely about recognizing their own bias. And that's kind of at the heart of the hostile media effect. Is it's not people being upset with partisan news. It's them being upset with something that a neutral observer would say, no, that's actually a totally fair assessment, right? Like that's the idea. So we're like, when we are putting news stories in front of the students, we want to make sure that the news story that they use is a fair, it's not a columnist, it's not an opinion piece. It's like a wire report from the Associated Press, right? It's something that's going to be kind of right down the middle, a mainstream news source where there isn't bias, because we're kind of not interested. We recognize, of course, that there is media bias, of course, right? And partisan media is a very important thing to deal with. But our sort of idea with this activity is to get people to think about your own bias. What is it about your attachment to this issue that may frustrate your ability to accurately evaluate it? How can I get you to be reflective and step back for a second before you decide something is partisan or not?
And I think this question also relates that if there are any students who are already beyond reach before your lesson, and this person has had students who have been uninterested in even engaging in media bias discussions and lessons, and we are here to indoctrinate them, is the thought. Oh. Did that make sense?
I think, like, I don't know, Nate, what,
Well,
I'm curious to hear your.
I mean, I think like that's why I think we try to use fanship and sports fandom as a proxy for partisanship, because we know people sort of get into their tribes and they get into their sort of political headspace and they won't concede anything. But if I can get a Cubs fan to admit that they're a little bit biased when they read coverage about the Cubs, right? If I can get you to admit that, then I'll bet that I can get you to admit your own partisanship, right? It's like, if I can get you to understand partisanship as a fanship as a proxy for partisanship, you're going to look silly denying that you're not politically biased. We all have a certain amount of political bias, right? And so if I can get that person to understand their fanship bias, I think it's a lot easier to get them to, you're partisan, we're all partisan. If you can't recognize that, then we've maybe got bigger problems than engagement in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things, like, I'm personally excited about when teaching about media effects, is because, like, it connects to us personally, and I feel like, as I learn more about media effects to teach it, I think about all the ways that with hostile media effect, I think about, how am I hostile to things, and how do I react to things in certain ways, depending on how important that issue is to me. So I hope that helps motivation for students, because they see exactly how they kind of play into this. And I find that, it also just organically, like, connects to students' prior experiences and what they can bring to the table when they're in the class. I think, student motivation isn't always an easy thing to overcome. I know that. But I think that media effects is a really interesting way to engage them and help them kind of have this new perspective of how media influences us.
And I think we're going to try to squeeze in just one last question. And that is, if you differentiate between bias versus worldview, given that neutrality is impossible, is there value in framing this around worldview and recognizing worldview? With the comment, maybe this is just splitting hairs around terminology.
So I'm just looking at the question here.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think, like, there are lots of different ways to think about bias and worldview. There was just a column from the Poynter Center recently that talked about a sort of developing a new scheme for evaluating, recognizing that objectivity is something that to be aimed for, but it's something that we are never going to achieve. Right. And so what are some other ways to think about bias? When we're talking about legitimate news reporting, I think what we talk about is, in the context of media effects, is the way that journalism work routines and organizational pressures sort of contribute to how an audience may be misinformed, right? And in fact, that's our thing with media effects, is that there are enough people talking about the effects of fake news. We're interested in how can somebody read mainstream news but still be misinformed in a way that is unintended by the mainstream media, right? But because of our own cognitive sort of ways of viewing things, and because of those work routines of how journalists, some journalists are close to the source, there are soundbite parameters, all of the different production sort of pressures on journalism that shape it. We sort of use media effects to talk about that. So that's where agenda setting comes in, is how do journalists prioritize the news? Framing, how do journalists present the news? Hostile media effect, how do individuals interpret the news? So when we do talk about bias and worldview, certainly there are those highly partisan news outlets, but we're sort of thinking about how can sort of little bits of bias creep into mainstream legitimate news reporting, because that's the kind of news that our students are encountering. They're not really seeing fake news as much as they're encountering real legitimate news, but you can still be misinformed accidentally with that kind of news.